Hello, welcome to 251. Two pianists, 5 minutes, one subject. And the title of this episode is What the French Horn. My name's Nick Tomlin.
And I'm Simon Whiteside. So to explain what is a French horn is a conical bore instrument that came from the hunting horn or the post horn, and it developed over time in orchestral music. It was one of the first brass instrument. It was the first brass instrument to get into the symphony orchestra, and along with the trumpet. Originally, you used to have to have what's called a crook replacement. If you wanted to play an E flat, you played basically what's called a natural horn, and you played in the key of E flat maybe, and it's near relatives, so dominant and subdominant. That's the fourth and fifth note of the major scale. And if you wanted to, therefore, movements would be in a key. But later on, you would be able to add valves to brass instruments, and once they were added, the valve French horn developed. Now, the modern French horn is actually called the double French horn because it has two, if you like, fundamental tubes. One is in F and the other is in B flat. So it covers an much bigger range and also is completely chromatic, whereas in the previous versions you were limited to the harmonic series on the instrument. So that said, we now need to talk about how the French horn fits into jazz. Over to you, Nick.
Well, the first significant use of the French horn was really with the Claude Thornhill band in the late 40s, although there are photographs of bands from the 20s with French horn. But very often these were just for publicity. Sometimes musicians would kind of get these instruments to give the band kind of kudos or kind of, to make them look classy. But there's no evidence they actually played them, these orchestral instruments. In the 30s, they were used, but often more as a kind of orchestral backing along with strings to kind of give the song a kind of lush backing. But it wasn't really until the 1940s, as I said, with Claude Thornhill, where his regular band actually featured two French horns. And in 1949, Miles Davis used a scaled-down version of the Thornhill band for his Birth of the Cool sessions, which became very influential. The French horn player on those sessions was Gunter Schuller, although Junior Collins depped when Schuller couldn't do it. The arrangements were by Gil Evans and Jerry Mulligan, and they really exploited the sound of the horn, and it really, at that point, became an integral part of the ensemble.
Yes, and Gil Evans and Jerry Mulligan were part of the Claude Thornhill arranging troupe, weren't they? And the West Coast took up this quite heavily after that Birth of the Cool recording. So the Marty Page Dectet with Mal Torme, also Art Pepper and Sammy Davis Jr., used the French horn in there, absolutely acknowledged from the Birth of the Cool influence. Monk at the Town Hall, Hall Overton, used it in a similar sort of arrangement with Robert Northern on French horn. Jerry Mulligan's Tentet had Pete Grass on French horn. Pete Ruggelow used French horn. Shorty Rogers in his Modern Sounds and Cool and Crazy, he used French horn. Often Vince DeRose was the French horn player on the West Coast. Gil Evans used the French horn a great deal. He used a guy called Jimmy Buffington in his sections sometimes, who played on Miles Ahead, and also in Mel Powell's sextet, which we will talk about in another one of these short podcasts. So finally, we need to talk about Jules Watkins.
Yeah, and in terms of improvising jazz, probably the most important figure is Jules Watkins. And he was born in 1921 and went on to record over 100 dates as leader and sideman. He performed with the greats, Milt Jackson, Sonny Rollins, Thelonious Monk, and formed his own band with Charlie Rouse called Le Jazz Mode. But yeah, he was a great player, great jazz player on the French horn.
And he was an improviser on the French horn,
yes,
which not all of the other players necessarily were.
No.
Which is an interesting factor in itself. But, in the modern times, we have our very own Jim Rattigan, who's done several French horn albums. And he is definitely an improviser. So that concludes our first 5-minute podcast. From me, Simon Whiteside, goodbye.
And from me, Nick Tomlin, goodbye.